Jane, we are so honoured to have you join us, and I'd now like you to invite you to say a few words about your book.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I mean, gosh, you've covered so much of my life. I normally go out nowadays saying I'm the author of Future Gen, I'm mum and a smallholder. But I'm so pleased to join you today. And I do apologise for making that fundamental idiot mistake of not actually registering for the event I was going to speak in. So huge thanks to Vicky for calmly and quietly, like you public affairs people do, just getting me back in just before I was due to contribute. I know that there are lots of people on the call who probably know a great deal about the well-being of Future Generations Act, and I'm sure we'll have some really good discussions. But I just thought that it would be useful to lay the ground for people who don't have that kind of experience as to the journey that Wales took following devolution. So I'd be grateful if you could enable participant screen sharing or not, depending on how we get on. Can we manage that?
I think you should be able to, in the middle there, it should say share screen.
No, it does, but it also says host has disabled participant screen sharing.
Vic, if you just click the little arrow next to share screen and then go down, it should say allow multiple people.
Yeah, it should be there now.
Okay. Yay. Thank you very much. Okay, so here we are. Just a sort of a short input really on the journey, and then we can make the slides available to people after this event. But what I've done in the context of the book is sort of laid out the book in the kind of principles from Professor Donella Meadows, who I just basically in awe of. I mean, just the most fantastic systems thinker. And one of the first people who back in the 1970s drew people's attention to the fact that we were overreaching the use of our environmental limits. And what I particularly like about Donella, and I think it's an important lesson in these times, is that she is inherently positive. Even when governments carry on behaving really, really badly, Donella was always looking at how to be optimistic, how to engage people in a positive debate about actions. And I just think that's a really important tenet in terms of how we move forward. So essentially, the story starts with the civil society and all those people who influenced the first Government of Wales Act, which was in 1998, and gave the incoming National Assembly for Wales a duty to promote. And very soon the Assembly itself adopted the Brundtland definition in terms of how it was going to define sustainable development in that context. And that duty to promote had two components. It required the executive to have a scheme laying out how it was going to deliver its obligations on promoting sustainable development. And then the next administration would then review how effective that was. And you can imagine that in a situation where you had administrations of one political persuasion, you could imagine a good review. And if you had administrations of different political persuasions, you could inherently imagine a different kind of outcome. And I think that, in a sense, kind of got tested in the first decade of the National Assembly. So the first scheme, which was overseen by Sue Essex, my wonderful mentor, and Sophie's too. It's one of those extraordinary women who just sort of enable you to understand the opportunity of politics as policy making. But the first scheme was about learning to live differently, because of course this is against the business as usual model. And the idea we had at the very beginning was that it would be the framework in terms of the National Assembly's work. And it was reviewed externally and found that, not least because of all the things that got in the way, foot and mouth and floods and the steel crisis and others, that actually it didn't feel very different. And the second scheme, which was overseen by Carwyn Jones, then Environment Minister and subsequently First Minister, he tried to do something more focused, sort of 10 things for a better planet, whereas the first one had been an overarching framework. And what I inherited, therefore, when I came in 2007 to this specific responsibility, having already introduced a number of things around this in my education role previously, was the fact that we'd had a big scheme and we'd had a targeted scheme. But what it didn't do was actually change the context in which we worked. And therefore, my ambition was to work on the principle of one Wales, one planet. We've only got one of each. We should make the best of them both, and how we should take that forward. And in my journey, in terms of putting that in place, it became clear to me that actually it wasn't enough to have a policy about promoting sustainable development. And in fact, the Wales Audit Office told us we'd never failed on it, but we were not doing anything substantially different from any other part of the United Kingdom. So when I left government and politics in 2011, I proposed for that election that we should now have a law, and that law should deliver that aspiration, which had been agreed by all the cabinet members, that sustainable development should be the central organising principle of government, a law, not a policy. And it takes a long time to make a law, particularly when you're making a law on something that nobody's ever made a law on before. And over that period of time between the manifesto through to 2015, there were a range of elements. 5 ministers were involved from different disciplines. So it went through community and education and sustainability and environment, for example. And I think that in many ways, the best thing that happened to my original Sustainable Development Bill was when it was named the Future Generations Bill. And the Wales We Want exercise was reflected what was happening across the world in terms of the developing of the SDGs, the world we want. What it showed us was that all the things we consulted on back in 2007 and 9 about One Wales, One Planet, actually the people of Wales, or the organisations in Wales, civil society in Wales, was really, really keen to see a very different kind of nation, which gave us all confidence in terms of moving forward. And Sophie will be able to say a lot more about this, because she deals with this on her every day in terms of the management of her role. But you can't have a law which, and particularly an unusual law, which within itself doesn't contain major penalties, which is how people think of laws, but which has to still have oversight in terms of how behaviour should change. So clearly, in a hierarchical way, the Welsh Government has a set of public services which are responsible to it. So it has a hierarchical role in terms of those public services. But the Future Generations Commissioner, and Sophie is the first Future Generations Commissioner with powers in the world, is somebody who therefore can advise and review and call out the behaviour of all those who are meant to deliver, the 40 named organisations. The Wales Audit Office has a role and works very closely with the Future Generations Commissioner's Office, and at the end, and in the courts, there's also the opportunity of judicial review. But just back to that truth-telling for a moment, it's really important that the truth is told about successes and failures, potentials and obstacles, and admit and bear the pain of the present while keeping a steady eye on the vision of a better future. And I think that sort of sums up my philosophy in the context of this. Now, most people on the call will probably know about the Act itself, because it's been in place since 2015. The 4 pillars, the 7 goals, the use of language in the goals, like for a prosperous Wales, innovative, productive and low carbon, the idea of decent work, in terms of employment opportunities, acting on climate change, limits of global environment, is all about looking upstream. So it's a very, very different kind of decision making, and covers the full range of the responsibilities, not just of Welsh Government, but of government. And in my view, this is about keeping people safe currently and long term into the future. And very importantly, if the goals are the what, then the 5 ways of working are the how. How do you do this? What should you be thinking about? And therefore, these key factors, long-term prevention, integration, collaboration, and involvement, are essential in terms of changing the decision-making and moving from short-term reactive decision-making to long-term planned interventions for the benefit of future generations. That's not the ones we know. That's not just our children and their children, or my mum's great-grandchildren. That's the future generations we don't even know, but we've been handing down our problems to them, with their nuclear waste, with their debt, or anything else. And therefore, if we want to protect the world for them and our country for them, we need to behave very differently. It's important they're linked to the Sustainable Development Goals, and there's a specific link, which oddly enough, for those who don't know this, not only is Wales the only country in the world that has legislation to deal with future generations and to safeguard their interests, it's the only country in the world that has a legislative commitment in terms of delivery on the SDGs. So we can see that, you know, Wales is now an outlier, and one of the big jobs that I hope we'll all have on this call is how we can help all the public services and indeed the people of Wales to lift their eyes to these ambitions. My learning in the context of writing the book and reflecting back on the 20 years that had led up to it are these elements here. We may want to pick up some of those. I mean, leadership. You've got to have leadership so that people can really understand what opportunities are available. But I'm really honest, the thing I want most is that the people of Wales will hold their public services to account if they don't behave effectively in terms of this agenda. And in terms of actually delivering on it, there must be the right support and financial mechanisms, how budgets are used, where money is allocated. But also we should learn from other countries. And I know that Sophie has got a number of sort of partners in place across the world where there is a lot of learning going on. And importantly, nature has rights too. Now, I say this because we often treat ourselves as humans as though we're separate from nature. But we're not, we're part of nature. And the very first Earth Summit talked about its first principle was that humans have the right to live in harmony with nature. And we are exercising that right, but we're probably not exercising the responsibility aligned to that right in the way we should. So actually there's 2 COPs this year, and they are equally important. There's the Biodiversity Cop in China, which lots of people may not even know about, which is happening in May, as well as the Climate COP happening in Glasgow. And I just think this is such an important, you know, sort of slide to finish on in the context of the Act, is that, you know, if we need a collective transformation that permits the best of human nature rather than the worst to be expressed and nurtured. And any other route is going to lead to collapse. And it doesn't matter whether that collapse is because we have people think the world has no limits and just carry on behaving as they do. I think most people, in many ways, most businesses, and particularly some of the fossil fuel businesses, are in that middle group. The people who know there are limits, they know they're doing something that they will not be able to do for much longer. So they extract as much as possible, and that will lead to collapse. But if we can believe that the limits are real and close and there's no time to waste and there's enough material, money, resilience and human virtue to bring about a planned reduction, that will serve us all. And I just finish with the fact that for me, I've always believed that governments are about the bottom 2 layers of the Maslow's hierarchy of needs. I don't believe governments are about defence of the realm. I believe that governments are about the safety of their populations and putting the measures in place. And we did this after the war, for example, but we've stopped doing it as we've thought there are other things we need to focus on. And so for me, it is about that clean air, water, food, shelter, sleep, clothing. I'm not so sure government should intervene on reproduction, but of course that's essential in the future of the human race. And thank you so much for being kind about the book. Some of you will know that in England, John Bird is working with Caroline Lucas in particular, and looking at how aspects of the Wales Act can be translated into that bigger context. And my fundamental message is that both the learning, what failed on the way, what successes there are, how we lift the ambition, it's all there in the book, but it's all there in the people of Wales. And what we want to do to now is demonstrate this is one way of making sure that actually we integrate all those wicked problems facing us and we tackle them appropriately for us, for people alive today, but for future generations. And as John Rawls, the American philosopher, said, do unto future generations what you would have had past generations do unto you.
Thank you so much for
That's
that, Jane. Thank you so much for that, Jane. That was really insightful and really wise words to leave us on. I'm now going to hand over to Sophie, who's also going to say a few words. Sophie, thank you again for joining us. It's such an honour to have you with us. And yeah, we're really excited to hear what you have to say about the Act for future generations.
Thanks very much for having me. Jane and I are very used to doing double acts together, and we often sort of catch up through these sort of presentations on where each one is in terms of this journey that we've been on in implementing the Future Generations Act. I'm going to try to share my screen. Hopefully you are seeing this. Okay. So the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, I'm not going to go through the stuff that Jane went through. I've got some of the same slides, but I suppose, you know, that it's important, that kind of legal duty on the 44 main public bodies in Wales to meet today's needs without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And those 44 public bodies, so all our local authorities, all our health boards, our fire and rescue services, Public Health Wales, Natural Resources Wales, significantly the Welsh Government itself. And then, as Jane said, this, you know, my role as an independent commissioner to oversee the progress being made there. Why is it kind of so important? Well, this is the kind of scale of the unborn generations that we're talking about. And as Jane said, we're not just talking about, you know, my children or your children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and so on. We're talking about future generations to come. And if we look back to the last 50,000 years, there's about 100 billion dead people. There's about 7.7 billion people living at the moment, and 50,000 years into the future is estimated to be about 6.75 trillion people. So the decisions that we are taking today, and I think we are in that period, particularly with some of the challenges around climate change in particular, we are in that period where the decisions that we are taking today or don't take today and should be taking could have a massive impact on that kind of 6.7 trillion people. So we're lucky in Wales. You wouldn't think that it was kind of unusual for a country to have a set of long-term goals which span beyond political cycles, electoral cycles, but actually it's really unusual, in fact completely unique. I suppose the only, you know, the closest thing really is the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, but of course they're not necessarily translated completely into domestic law in different countries, but that's essentially what we've done here in Wales. So we've got Senedd elections coming up. Each you know, political party will have to interpret through their manifesto how they meet these goals, but these are the statutory long-term goals for Wales. So my job, I suppose, is to assess how this is going. And as Jane and Gwyneth mentioned, this year I published my first Future Generations report, and I think, you know, I particularly like this this quote from Oscar Wilde: "A map of the world that does not include utopia is not even worth glancing at." This is an interactive version of the Future Generations report, and this is my vision of a Wales that we want in 2050. So do go onto the website and have a look, where you can, you know, zoom in detail. But we have things. You will note that our wellness centres or wellbeing centres are completely outnumbering our hospitals. You will notice that we've got green infrastructure everywhere. There's disabled rugby being being played here. There down the bottom here is a reuse centre. Here you can see Welsh poetry taking us on that river down to the sea. So this is all about really a vision of like how would you visualize those 7 wellbeing goals in action. I was reflecting today that I think it was around about this this time, gosh, about 12 years ago, that I went to work for Rhodri Morgan as one of his advisors when he was the First Minister of Wales, and that led me to consider what would Rhodri say about how things are going. And he was famous for his do one-legged ducks swim in circles. Maybe a lot of you are too young to remember that one, but I suppose this is my analogy of kind of where we are. So there's an 800-page report in the Future Generations report, but in a snapshot analogy, I would say that money's increasingly being put where mouth is, but in government, one arm still doesn't know what the other one's doing, and sometimes we've got our arms tied behind our back. So this is some of the challenge of implementing this legislation. So the join up between things, hugely challenging. So on the one hand, we've got a government who declares a climate emergency and puts an extra 220 million quid into direct funding that climate emergency, so direct action on decarbonisation. On the other hand, you've got a government who are spending about 75 to 80% of their whole infrastructure budget on building new roads. So those things, one hand doesn't know what the other hand is doing. On the one hand, we've got an absolute crisis in terms of health. Beyond even the pandemic, and perhaps there's lots of people talking about the pandemic being a dress rehearsal for things to come, and I'm going to talk in a moment around the fact that on the other hand we know what makes the biggest difference to keeping people healthy and well, and it's things that are outside of the health service. So how are we joining all of these things up? The good news, however, is increasingly we are seeing some really different policies and progressive policies aligned with the Future Generations Act coming from the Welsh Government. So last week, the Economic Resilience and Reconstruction Plan from government, with a wellbeing economy at the centre of their plan. So we would never have seen an economic recovery or an economic plan of any sort from the government 5 years ago or even 3 years ago, which had wellbeing economics at the heart of our economic strategy for government, with prosperous, green and equal being the kind of key pillars of that. Just that tweet there, this is someone from Scotland. There's lots in here that can be critiqued, but can we all just pause for a second and appreciate a national economic plan that entirely left out the words growth and GDP, not even rescued as the mythical inclusive, just gone, lovely. That is the extent of the kind of new and progressive direction that is being taken by the government. And then we've got things like a forward-looking low carbon transport strategy. So a transport travel hierarchy, which puts, so this is where, funding allocations will go, all schemes will have to look at first how, routes can be developed or responses can be through walking, cycling, then public transport, then ultra low emissions vehicles, and only then, if those avenues have been exhausted and can't possibly be used, other private motor vehicles. It completely embeds the Future Generations Act. There are going to be challenges in terms of delivery, but on that point of putting money where mouth is, over the last year's budget, we've seen a 67% increase in funding for sustainable transport. Good news again in the budget today, an extra 20 million for active travel. So this is going in the right direction, and this is an area that I've been particularly focused on because, as Jane said, we said that sustainable development would be a central organising principle within the government. The Welsh Government has been responsible for transport from the very beginning, and it was an area that was absolutely stagnant in terms of a reduction in carbon emissions. So there's nowhere for the Welsh Government to hide there, and now we're starting to see this really kind of significant change. Just a kind of reflection here on perhaps how things change. So The M4 Relief Road, many of you will know, was, I suppose, one of the big kind of, early test cases in terms of the legislation. So here's my friend in the CBI. I'm a negative Future Generations Commissioner, and I should be a cheerleader for business. I was calling for completely, terrible things like the fact that there should be more to prosperity than economic growth, and that the borrowing powers used to finance the M4 Relief Road would have been ill-conceived, and that I still want to be convinced how the new 38 million semiconductor plant in Newport is actually going to connect those high-quality skilled jobs back to people furthest from the labour market. Outrageous propositions to put forward, and yet then we see how things are changing. So we're seeing in a CBI letter to the First Minister in June 2020 supporting my calls for a low carbon environmental goods and services prioritising retrofitting of all homes and helping Welsh firms build resilient supply chain and incentivise remote working for those employees that wish to do so. So that is the kind of, some of the fundamental change that we're seeing. Again, new national planning policy, fully centred around the Future Generations Act. So the outcomes required through our planning decisions now, through our national policy, are around creating, sustaining communities, making best use of our resources, growing our economy in a sustainable manner, maximising environmental protection, facilitating accessible and healthy environments. Again, complete kind of shift in emphasis there. However, where are the big challenges going forward? And seeing as, I suppose, the kind of big crises that we're talking about at the moment is a health crisis, I just wanted to link some of the big challenges back to our health and the way that we think about health here in Wales. So this is a graph from the World Health Organization, who've identified the reasons for the health inequality gap. And the gap is such that I'm talking to you from Whitchurch in Cardiff. If I travelled about 3 miles down the road to Butetown in Cardiff and I live there, I have every chance of dying 10 years younger. So that's the extent of the health inequality gap that we are experiencing. And if anyone read the BBC article which quoted Dr. Kelechi Nonaham from he's the Public Health Director in Cwm Taf. He said it all really, in terms of Cwm Taf being the area with the highest rate of deaths from COVID, entirely predictable in terms of the socioeconomic disadvantage that we see there, and those very clear connections back to people's health. And that's not just in the case of a kind of public health and COVID emergency, that is equally applicable more broadly. So the things that make a difference here, 35% of what makes a difference is income security and social protection, 29% your living conditions, 19% social and human capital. You'll see that all of these are very closely aligned to the last slide that Jane showed on Maslow's hierarchy of need. And so if we're focused on wanting to keep our population safe and healthy and well, it's these areas that we need to be focusing on. And as we think about that in a, and the lessons learned from the pandemic as well, we also have to consider how well prepared were we for that emergency, which again was entirely predictable. A global pandemic has been in the top 10 global risks for a number of years. The top 3 actually are all related to climate and ecological breakdown. So flooding, economic collapse from climate change, and so on, top 3 in the global risk register. So we do have to sit back, I think, as a, as an electorate, as a society, and question how well are our governments across the world preparing for these known or entirely predictable shocks. And I think this sort of image sums it all up really. COVID-19, the economic fallout of that, and then if you layer climate change onto that, we're into some really big trouble. However, I think there is a kind of bright side to that, because the whole world really, and I think, very much Wales has led the way in this regard, is talking about reconstructing post-COVID in a way which will not just help us build back what we've lost in terms of COVID, but will help us meet our carbon emissions targets and help us to tackle climate change and biodiversity loss and inequality as well. So what does that look like from the perspective of the sorts of things that I'm saying we should be considering? And these are things that are in my manifesto for the future. So on income security, that 35% of what makes a difference to that health inequality gap. There's huge opportunities around green jobs and skills, around the potential for around 60,000 new jobs in the next 2 years to be created in these low carbon industries. And if we're clever about targeting those jobs and those skills pipelines towards those who are most disadvantaged, we can be meeting our aspirations for a green and just recovery. However, I just want to show you this because this is some of the challenges with this. So again, this is where the kind of, narrative isn't necessarily matching, the action isn't necessarily matching the narrative. So if we genuinely want to make use and take advantage of that green and just recovery, our skills pipeline is nowhere near where it needs to be. So we can see, for example, that on the one hand, the FM is talking on the weekend about the national forest, and that's hugely exciting and I think hugely progressive. But you can also see that apprenticeship levels in reforestation and natural flood defence are currently in the enrolments are between about 60 to 120 a year, when actually the job potential in that area is 3,600 jobs. So we need to get our act together, and that point that I was making around one arm needing to know what the other one's doing, and currently that's not the case, we need to get better at that. If we're going to really develop and deliver this green and just recovery, we need to sort that sort of stuff out. A universal basic income. This is raising up the agenda massively now. We've seen, I suppose it would have seemed completely left of field even this time last year, but when you've had a furlough scheme, which for very many people has almost been doing that, when we've seen the fact that it's people working in the gig economy, and that's where the future sadly is, the gig economy, 0-hour contracts and so on, that's where future trends and scenarios are taking us. That says to me that the welfare state is not fit for even the current, let alone what those future trends might bring. A universal basic income has, could, based on some work that I've been doing, halve poverty in Wales. So is this some of the big, new progressive type approaches that we should be considering? Social partnership bill, published last week, many of you will be aware of that. The economic contract, our ask of business, something for something. Back before the pandemic, I think about 350 businesses had signed up to an economic contract with government, where if they get money, they have to demonstrate how they are also decarbonising, how they're upskilling their workforce, and how they're focusing on the physical and mental health of their workforce. There's more than 3,000 businesses now that have received money and have signed that economic contract. But is anyone monitoring that? And is anyone following that up? And is anyone providing the right support to those businesses to help them do the things that they've said that they will do? Better procurement. In the last week, I've launched a procurement report which outlines some of the things that we should be doing there, and a national mission on education and lifelong learning. So lifelong learning will have to become the new normal with the pace of change in terms of our digital skills and a whole range of other skills. We will have to go back to recognising the importance of that learning throughout the life course, where there has been a massive decline over the last number of years. Living conditions, investing in housing retrofit, a no-brainer in my view, because if you are doing that, you're helping to create green jobs, you're improving communities, you're taking people out of fuel poverty, and you're helping to meet your decarbonisation targets. However, it's going to cost about £1 billion a year if we want to bring all homes in Wales up to EPC A rating. So we've got to find some new ways of financing that. A right to housing, 20-minute neighbourhoods. So how could we build these cohesive communities around being able to access everything you need within 20 minutes of your home? As well as that, nature on your doorstep. We should be giving people the opportunity to access nature within 300 metres of their home. And there's an equality angle to that too, because if you're in a more deprived community or from a Black, Asian and minority ethnic community, you are much less likely to be able to access nature. So we've got to think about clever ways of helping to maintain and enhance biodiversity whilst also cleaning and greening communities. Active travel, absolutely key both to the social and human capital element and to some of those living conditions, but then also thinking about opportunities around intergenerational housing, things that they do in some of the Scandinavian countries where they pair younger people in low-cost housing with older people who might be lonely and isolated, and the younger people, you know, spend time with them and get a lower kind of rent cost, you know, for doing that. There's a whole range of things in the 48 recommendations in my manifesto for the future. I know we're going to get into a bit more of that in terms of the questions, so I'll stop there. But I think that these Senedd elections, what we've seen so far is incredibly promising in terms of policy, but we have to make sure that we are going into action more than words in terms of delivering this, you know, or at least a progressive pathway to this perhaps utopia that I've outlined in my reports.
Thank you so much, Sophie. That was really, really useful. I'm wondering if we could possibly even share those slides following the event with our attendees. I think that might be really useful, and same as well with you, Jane. I think people might really value being able to see those. So we have a host of questions, which is really great, that people have asked. So I wanted to ask, my first question is both to Sophie and Jane. So I know you both touched on this in your contributions, but for Sophie, as we look ahead to the recovery from the pandemic, do you think political parties, Welsh Government, public bodies, etc., are thinking sustainably enough in their recovery plans? Are they prioritising a joined up approach, or is the stress and the large scale challenge kind of moving focus away from sustainability and future thinking? And for Jane, did you ever imagine that the legislation would have to adapt to such a challenge with such extreme economic pressures? It might be easy for some to want to put aside that future thinking and just focus on the here and now, as it were. Or is it flexible enough and necessary to meet that challenge? I'll turn to Jane first and then Sophie.
I think, interestingly enough, I've done about 130 events across the world linked to my book since it came out in June. And oddly enough, all the issues around COVID have meant that more and more governments and more people, more and more campaigning groups across the world are looking at how they can change the way governments currently do business, and particularly the short-termism. And I was on a call in the United States, and somebody was sort of talking about, you know, all the key issues that have happened in the context of the Black Lives Matter debate and all the issues around inequality, looking at all those, as Sophie outlined in her report, those people who are experiencing in many ways structural inequalities in Wales that they've experienced for a really long time. And we've got so many of those across the world, and they've been hit hardest by COVID, and they'll be hit even harder by climate change. And yet, actually, if you've got a future generations framework in place, you can take all these together and integrate the outcomes, so that the Wales Future Generations Act looks at inequality, but it also looks at the idea of having safe and cohesive communities. When it looks at issues around health, it wants to tackle things upstream. And we know that, you know, although we don't know absolutely yet the specific cause of this pandemic, we know that pandemics are caused by that interaction of climate change and deforestation and abuse in the sense of nature. So we've got a mechanism in Wales that can deal with pandemics, that can deal with inequality, that could tackle some of these wicked issues around Black Lives Matter, and explicitly pledges to take action, and very key action, in the context of climate change and biodiversity. We know that yet everybody's rising to that challenge in the way we might want, but it has made the values framework itself much more interesting to other parts of the world. And I think that since Wales has led the way in delivering it, then we should be really calling on whoever is the government after May to really show that leadership in the context of delivery.
Thank you, Jane. Sophie, we'll turn to you.
So, I mean, I think there's some really promising things coming from the, the government's response, I suppose, and particularly its kind of plans around reconstruction in terms of the pandemic. So, the things that I've outlined there, that national transport strategy has, come out just a couple of months ago. The economic resilience plan, which only came out last week. The money that is going into active travel, the money that's going into housing retrofit, and so on. I think that all of those things are good things, and most of the political parties are talking about this sort of green and just recovery. I think the challenge is that we've got to be really careful not to get lost in that and go, oh, it's all jolly good, everyone's talking about a green and just recovery, because the devil is in the detail, sort of when you scratch beneath the surface as to whether anything is actually changing. And some of those things that I highlighted there in terms of the skills pipeline, that demonstrates to me that no, we haven't got our act together in terms of a green and just recovery, because stuff's not changing there. So I think those are some of the issues that we kind of need to be focused on going forward. And I think those are some of the things that whatever, as Jane said, whatever government is in power needs to be called out on. I think the other things to just flag is why is the narrative not acted upon, and what are the blockers in the system? And you guys working in public affairs, and particularly working in government affairs, will I'm sort of preaching to the converted here, and this is possibly the bane of your life like it is of mine, but that kind of that lack of join up in government. Someone described it to me the other day as the critically mundane, which I kind of is my new favorite phrase. So the critically mundane stuff that stops this good stuff happening and strategic policy intent being carried through is the fact that the skills people aren't talking to the economic resilience plan people, and the housing retrofit people are ploughing money into housing retrofit without working out whether they've got any people to do the jobs that they're creating. So it's those critically mundane join up in government stuff, which is either going to make or break whether we genuinely are not just talking the talk but walking the walk in terms of the Future Generations Act.
Thank you, Sophie. I liked how you said in a panel recently, it's like having an ambulance at the bottom of a cliff rather than having some joined up thinking that can really solve those problems. So you don't need the ambulance at the bottom of the cliff. I'll hand over to Chizzy now, who has some panel questions.
Yeah, so my question is to you, Sophie. So you've spoken about introducing a new ministerial portfolio and the Minister for Prevention. I was just interested to know, what would that look like and what would their responsibilities be? And also, how do you envisage this minister working alongside other ministers, particularly the Minister for Health and Social Cares and the Minister for Environment, Energy and Rural Affairs?
Yeah, really good question. Thanks, Chizzy. So I think the important point for me to make is that we thought long and hard about this, because I come from a background in equality. I worked for the Equal Opportunities Commission and the Equality and Human Rights Commission, and there was this whole debate at the time about kind of equality mainstreaming and the challenge of, you don't just want to have a kind of equality officer who everyone goes to and expects them to do the equality stuff, which absolves everyone else of any responsibility. That's absolutely not what is intended, and I know that that's a risk. However, in terms of the Minister for Prevention, so this would not take away any of the responsibility capabilities of other ministers to demonstrate how they are considering prevention. But there does need to be that kind of strategic priority setting and corralling of issues for prevention. So if I just, take that example of, the wider determinants of health that we've been talking about, I've just before I joined this meeting was having a conversation around how the budget allocates £50 million for 21st century schools, but at the moment, there's no requirement on new schools to be built to be active travel schools. And yet we have 26% of our children who are overweight or obese, and 58% of our adult population. So it would seem to me to be a sensible thing to prevent ill health and obesity and demand on the NHS and congested roads for our education minister to be saying, you can only access this money if you have an active travel school. But what we're not doing, but what the education minister is saying is active travel is not my area, that's the transport minister. So what I'm saying is we need to escalate, we need to have someone who has ministerial, authority to go into different portfolios, work out where the preventative spend is best, or the prevention or the money is best spent in terms of prevention. And the other recommendation is that should go alongside a 10% start off top slice of budgets in order to fund that preventative activity. Because if we don't do that, I fear that we're just going to be, fiddling around the edges and not having that real significant shift.
Great, thank you so much, Sophie. My next question is for Jane. I love how much of the progress of the Act coming into being in your book you attribute to those also working outside of the Senedd. You say in your chapter on networking that groundbreaking legislation we have now is an articulation of the One Wales, One Planet into law, but a law that was influenced enormously by people outside government, and that you want to pay a huge tribute to the 30 civil society members of the Sustainable Development Alliance like WWF, Oxfam, Friends of the Earth, etc. And you really attributed a lot of success to the ability to work outside of the constraints of just government. So do you think the Act would be what it is now without the public affairs sector and those representatives who really fed into the process?
No, I think the Act was incredibly well informed by those third sector inputs. But of course, the very first Sustainable Development Scheme, Learning to Live Differently, if you go back and look at that in light of what we now know, you'll see tremendous similarities between that scheme and what is now in law. And I think the point that I just want to pick up from the chat, that the difference between policy and law is that law is enduring. And of course, governments may or may not deliver a law more or less effectively, but law is enduring. And it does mean that people can call the public sector out. There is a Future Generations Commissioner. It is a statutory function. And therefore, people will be able, over time, as they get to know their rights under the law, i.e. that the public services should behave differently in terms of dealing with that. So I think those two things together are really important. We started off with a weak law and an ambitious intent, and now we have a stronger law, and now people have to be encouraged to rise to that level of ambition. And I just want to finish by saying that point that Sophie's just made about somebody in the cabinet is really important. I mean, I was very privileged because I did the role under Rhodri Morgan when Rhodri Morgan effectively asked me to be him in the context of the role I had in sustainable development. So I had the authority to interrogate other ministers about what they were doing. And unless that you have that, then sustainability just becomes another separate portfolio. So in a sense, there needs to be somebody who on behalf of the First Minister leads on that overarching understanding of whether the Cabinet is delivering on its own obligations and requirements in the context of delivering on well-being of future generations.
We'll just do one more question. I know Chizzy has one she wants to ask from the chat.
Yeah, sorry, it's just hard to pick because there's been so many. We'll go with Nathan's question on how he'd like to hear from you both, your views on how to embed a genuine culture shift across the public sector when it comes to this Act.
Sophie, do you want to go first, and then we'll go to Jane?
Okay. So there's a long list of things that I think we need to do to embed genuine culture change. And if you're particularly interested, if you read chapter 2 of my Future Generations report, it goes through all of them. I think that the first thing is that we need more support and sort of hand holding of some of what are kind of quite beleaguered in many cases public sector professionals. I mean, they were beleaguered perhaps, after a decade of austerity prior to a pandemic, and now they've gone from a decade of austerity into a pandemic and all of the responses around that. So I think that we do need some extra support. I think we need to reduce the complexity of the landscape that they're operating within. And again, this goes back to my point about one arm not necessarily knowing what the other one's doing. So we just layer more and more boards, different requirements not aligned with each other when they're all trying to achieve the same thing from government. And sometimes that results in us just spinning, the public sector workforce around trying to deliver multiple competing priorities without a sense of, what is important and how does all of this fit together. I think that there needs to be some that the system itself needs to try to help to make things happen. So things like, if you're performance managed to deliver short-term outcomes, you'll deliver short-term outcomes. And so we need to change some of those systems structurally. Likewise, if you're funded to deliver something within a year and then you don't know what's going to happen after that, that doesn't, facilitate that kind of longer term approach. So I think there's those structural barriers. I also think that, however, that there are people out there, and I call them the frustrated champions, who are finding better ways of doing things and navigating a system which is often working against them. And they use the Future Generations Act as permission to challenge the system. So I think it's about us finding those frustrated champions. I think it's part of my role to get behind them, support them, showcase what they're doing, help them to break down barriers and connect them with other frustrated champions and build a movement that way.
Yeah, I think the only thing I'd add to that is that there are an awful lot of public servants, particularly at the lower levels in our public services, who love this. I mean, they really, really want this to be delivered. And I wonder if it's possible for there almost to be a kind of like national proposition where the government is prepared, and the public services, but I think jointly prepared to put some money in to see a big move forward in every single one of those 44 named bodies that can be funded, that would really deliver the aspirations of the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. So I think almost in a way we've got to make it kind of really exciting, so that people are thinking, yeah, what can I do? Not the minimalist approach that some people are doing. I know that there are lots of people in some of those organisations who are looking at how little they can do to comply with the Act. And in essence, what we want out of this is everybody thinking as how much freedom does this Act give me to have permission to think differently and to be really ambitious for changing the future for my children, their children, etc., 7 generations onwards. And if we're going to make it exciting, government has to be confident enough to ask for help, because governments are very small in small countries, and without asking for help, without the creation of a movement, without people calling out public services for not delivering and being ambitious about what they want to see happen, we will not get the change as quickly as we might. So some really exciting propositions that absolutely test the boundaries of the back of the Act upwards, not downwards, I think would be a great way for a new administration to start its work.
Well, thank you so much for that, both of you. That's really excellent. I think we've all learnt so much today. I just want to say again that Sophie's Sophie's book, that Jane's book is available online. We popped the link in the chat, and then we've also, I know Jack has put the link to the Future Gen Manifesto as well in the chat. So we've got all those resources there for you both. Just on a close, I just wanted to ask if either of you wanted to give a tip or a hint for how we can all be more sustainable in our own lives going forward, just as a final word to everyone. And thank you, everyone. I know we have gone a few minutes over. Jane,
well, shall I start?
Yeah, let's start with you, Jane.
Because one of the things that's gone down really well when people have read the book, and the book has got 140 voices, including Sophie's in it, and people from inside Wales and outside and beyond, is that we as a family, when I took on the responsibility of being Minister in 2007 of Environment, we took the decision to do one green thing every year. And we virtually voted on it as a family about what we were going to do. And that has now led us to living in a low carbon house, a low carbon life. And I'm taking gas out of my life next week. And that will mean that we now have low carbon in every aspect of our lives. And it's been an absolute roller coaster of a journey. But if I could recommend one thing to everybody, it's just do one green thing, because you don't know what it's going to be when you start in year one. But you suddenly find there are all sorts of amazing people and ideas that you get as a result of it. So just do one green thing every year, and then you can really challenge those public services for not delivering for you.
Great idea, great one, Jane. I'm going to focus on what I'm about to do next, which is eat my dinner, which is made up from vegetables which were left over from Sunday dinner, whizzed up with a bit of pesto and some chicken stock from a carcass, which we kind of boil up every week. So food waste, if you saw the BBC yesterday, I think it's something like 7.5 million tons of food waste from the UK every year, and 75% of that from households. And there was some figure which I can't remember about, the carbon emissions which come from that are the equivalent of, I don't know, something like 675,000 trees or some huge number like that. So there are loads and loads of things that we can do. I'll take my makeup off tonight with reusable pads. There's a whole range of things that are out there. But I agree with Jane, make one sustainable decision. And I think it's about thinking about it. I usually do it like this. Is there a better way that I could do it? Is there a greener, more sustainable way that I can do it? And if you can build in a bit of fun and cost saving or what have you with that as well, even better.
Great, thank you so much, everyone. We'll leave it there. Thank you, everyone, so much. I'm sure we will all speak to you all again soon. Thank you.